let's go ahead and get started since we're a little bit after 1 or 12 p.m. Just got a private chat. So thank you everyone for joining us today for the Montana Institute on Ecosystems Rough Cut Seminar Series. I think we're going to have folks, we're using, as you can see, GoToMeeting today versus our usual WebEx link, but we're going to have people coming in probably after this, and I think people have the correct link and all should be good on that end. But very excited for our speakers in our presentation today. But before I dive into introductions for each of our speakers, I am going to go through just some housekeeping items related to being on this virtual platform. So the first order of business, and I apologize, I don't know how to turn off that meeting entry tone, so that might continue to happen. So apologies to everyone on that. I'm trying to find it on GoToMeeting. But the first thing is just to make sure that your microphones are muted. So just take a quick scan to make sure that you are muted and that you remain muted throughout the presentation. We don't want to get any background noise or interference while our speakers are talking. The second thing is about questions for our speakers and about the presentation. So we are going to hold all of our questions until after the presentation is over. But if you have any questions that do come up while the presentation, the seminar is happening, please feel free to enter those into the chat box, and you'll see it's like a little word bubble. On my view, at least, it's at the very top, and you can just type it into the chat, either to everyone, you can send it to me directly. I'll make sure that those questions that come into the chat during the presentation get to our speakers. And at the end, like I said, we'll actually have a Q&A period. So feel free to chat or type your questions and then, or unmute yourself at that point to ask questions. And the third thing is that we will be recording today's seminar, and we always post the recordings of our rough cut seminars on the IOE website, and I'll make sure to send the link to where you can find the video in the chat function. Again, I mentioned that at the end of the presentation, but yeah, you can go back and watch it, or if somebody has missed this today and you want to send it to them, that is also an option. So housekeeping items out of the way, I am very excited about who we have with us today. Just as a whole, they'll be presenting on a conservation atlas of Montana, but we have 3 different speakers. We have a lot of people joining us for today's seminar. So first we have Bruce Bugbee. He's a professional, is a professional conservationist and has been since 1972, and is the founder and president of the American Public Land Exchange in Missoula here in Montana. We have Robert Kiesling, who's the founding director of the Big Sky Field Office of the Nature Conservancy, and the current operator of Outlandish, a Helena-based conservation real estate company. And we have John Wright, a retired Regents professor at New Mexico State University and a former land use planning director in Montana, who has 44 years of experience in designing conservation easements in Montana and the American West. And I've asked each of our speakers, once they start presenting, that they can expand on a little bit more on who they are and what they've done. But I will leave it at that. I'm going to go ahead and start screen sharing. So let me come just a moment, get the presentation up. Okay. Awesome. Are y'all seeing this on your computers? Go to that.
There we go.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn my webcam off, but I will be watching and here.
Okay. Madison, thank you. This is Jack Wright speaking. We've had some issues with the technology, so what you're going to see rather clunky is a pen being lifted when the slide changes and pen going down when it goes in reverse. So apologies for that. Thank you all so much for making the time. This project really is the biography of a great big conservation idea. It started opportunistically, almost by random, the 3 of us and so many others in the state coming to this landscape, caring about it deeply. How do we make sure it goes on? How do we maintain ecological functionality, beauty, culture, and place? And so the basic landscapes, you know, when you arrive, they're very diverse. I'm a native of Maine. I moved to Montana almost 50 years, more than 50 years ago here, and was struck right away by some of the similarities: the highlands, the lowlands, the forests. And over the years, as I've studied as a geographer, that's what I did: biogeography, environmental planning, cultural geography. I studied with a lot of different people. I was looking for a way to find a way to help conserve landscapes. And so I studied with Bob Much at the Fire Lab on fire ecology, Steve Arno on habitat types, Bob Pfister, so many others, and on to Berkeley, where Bruce Maxwell, you may have heard, of course, of Herbert Baker, the guy in diaspore dispersals and pollination biology and weeds and so forth. And I was fortunate to study with him, and Luna Leopold took me out on the ground and we looked at stream systems and the like. But it turns out, at first I was thinking about land use planning, and more on that in a moment. It turns out the teachers that really mattered to me were my two partners in crime here, Bruce Bugbee and Bob Kiesling, because they had already were ahead of me and starting to do these novel things called conservation easements and the like. So when I first arrived in the state, of course, you come for the mountains, you stay for everything else, including the mountains. And I had this idea, of course, that with all the national forest lands protected, in a sense, of course, naive that I was, I didn't really understand at that moment how critical the lowlands were. And you start looking at the gaps. Remember the old gap project, the gap analysis. Well, this was geographic pieces that were privately owned between the parks and the wilderness areas. And then when you look a little closer, how little of the Forest Service and the state itself is roadless, because then you start moving on to the basic data. 71% of the state is privately owned, and only 4% of it is wilderness. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself with a punchline here, but in terms of land conservation projects that have been done in the state, we're now at about 6% additional conserved land. So a bit more, quite a bit more than wilderness, we now have private land and lands that have changed status. It's a rather remarkable picture. But, and of course, these lands, as all of you very well know, perform tremendous ecological functions, not just ecological services for us, but for the system, ecological systems themselves, and the connectivity, the sort of circulatory system, the musculature of the state. How do we link high elevation with low in a time of climate change? How do we allow for latitudinal migration? How do species begin to have a fighting chance as climates change to move from place to place? The threat, as we think of it in the lowlands, in the valleys, seems mundane, and it's land subdivision and housing development. And how do we deal with that? Well, I call myself a recovering land use planner. I was the planning director in two different counties, Mineral County, Superior, and Granite County out of Phillipsburg. And I went into this as my first attempt to integrate all this knowledge that I was trying to acquire, to find a way to, in essence, stop key lands from being developed. And all of the tools used on private land are hindered by the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, or perhaps clarified might be a better word, is that subdivision regs and zoning are not designed or legally capable of stopping development. They deal with how land will be developed. So the decision is already made. And what we see in the law on private land is what's called the takings line under the Constitution. You can't regulate beyond a certain line without just compensation. So if that's true, how do we conserve key lands? What is the alternative? Well, it turns out beyond the taking line is giving or selling. Instead of regulating, negotiating, transactional analysis rather than mandating, and dealing with lawsuits and squabbles and political fights. And the tools, donation or sale of development rights called conservation easements, buy land, exchange land, mitigate for dams, find sources of common ground for strategies. These are the things that don't just work in Montana, but work all over the country and all over the world. And to get at that, a brief look at what are property rights on private land. Many of us are familiar with policies on public land and public input processes and so forth. We're dealing with essentially development rights, subdivision, buildings, energy development, commercial use, industrial use, and so forth. And those are the things that regulatory systems of land development, they can move them around, but they cannot stop something from happening. And so the way we often visualize this is this series of rights, a bundle of sticks that you can sever and move these rights around. And the main tool that is used in the world we're speaking about is the conservation easement, one of the tools in our toolkit. And it is a voluntary agreement. That's a key word, between a landowner, a land trust, or unit of government to keep the land basically as is, to donate or sell most or all of the right to subdivide and develop the property. And this is in perpetuity, it runs with the land. Notice how different that is. And it's to conserve key resources. And at first we started opportunistically, one piece at a time. That doesn't serve landscape ecology. And from that evolves strategic thinking. And that's part of what the analysis in this atlas will do. What's the status today of conserved lands? Are we getting the job done ecologically? And the key driver here, again, is fidelity to the Constitution. And it's kind of liberating to say, yes, if we want to protect a piece of land, we have to find financial compensation. And a conservation easement can be appraised, the value of what's given up, and it can be written off in a state, lower the value of the state, but key for many is also federal and state income tax deductions, which are quite powerful today. Notice how diverse the amount of conservation purposes are for conservation easement use. And the key thing, notice, a part of a government land conservation strategy, that gives a lot of leeway for planning, a kind of planning that works for the outcome of conservation. Why would a landowner do this? There are many emotional reasons. To keep it in the family. Sometimes they don't trust their kids to inherit it. Let's get real here. And to honor a vision of stewardship, and once again, the money. So as evidence of the philosophical power of this approach, these are just some of the ranch and farm groups that support the use of conservation easements. Notice the Montana Cattlemen's Association is there. I triple checked their website, and yes, what they say is, this is a viable choice. Look into it, do your due diligence. And they specifically name the Montana Land Reliance as an ag-friendly land trust group. And that's what this is, an NGO, a non-government group. And look at the total by local, statewide, and national NGOs called land trusts. It's 56 million acres. Importantly, that's a 2015 data. 2020 surveys being done, it might be 70, 75 million acres now. And it also does not include city-county programs, state programs, federal programs that we'll be speaking of in a moment. So the status, one of the reasons we're doing the atlas is to refine the data and look at the patterns, use GIS and map it. Try to apply landscape ecology, conservation, technology thinking to these places. We're at least 5 million acres in the state. Notice the Montana Land Reliance is 1.2 million acres of the land trust total, the local ones. The Nature Conservancy, 1.1. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks stands out because Kiesling, Bugbee, and I did some training many years ago. I think that was in the 80s. They were really quite leery of this new idea called a conservation easement. And today, about half the land that they have conserved in recent years has been through conservation easement acquisitions, sometimes purchased, sometimes donated. Notice there's also city-county programs, cropland reserve, special case. But this is what we guess the totals are. It's why we need to do the project, to really assess and map the patterns and see what's going on in the state. And for those who have interest in how that tool works, a fine volume available on Amazon. Well, I co-authored this book a few years ago on how these projects happen. What are all the choices that can be made in designing and applying easements around the West. So that's just a kickoff. And now I'd like to hand the ball off to one of those teachers I mentioned. It's not Michael Soule or Luna Leopold or anybody, it's or Herbert Baker, but this is he and Bruce were the people that showed me a way out of my frustration with being a land use planner and being having guns shot over my house, and finally getting it that we have to negotiate and not regulate. And the next speaker up is Bob Kiesling. Bob,
thanks, Jack. Yeah, you all should know that the three of us have set about on a book publishing project in which we attempt to compile maps, data, and most especially narratives of the work that's gone into getting this greater than 5 million acres of private land conservation achieved in Montana. So our arc of conservation for this book project is anchored in the past at 1970, which is the first Earth Day, of course, in April of that year. It's anchored in the present in 2020. So we've got a 50-year arc of conservation that we are wrestling with and stuffing into this book project. One of the features of the book is to highlight certain regions or sub-regions of Montana where conservation efforts have been particularly successful. And for this part of our presentation today, I'd like to address the conservation along the Rocky Mountain front, which you see in this graphic is anchored on the east by Great Falls, on the south by Helena, to the southwest by Missoula, to the north, the Canadian border and the Blackfeet Reservation. This is a graphic that from 1990, and I show it here to show you just how little land was preserved by the time 1990 rolled around. If you subtract the Pine Butte Preserve, which is in the middle of that graphic, and the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Ranch on the north and the Sun River Wildlife Management Area to the south, if you subtract these areas, the only ones that were extant prior to 1970 were the Sun River Game Range to the south. And it wasn't the case that the Blackleaf Wildlife Management Area and the Ear Mountain Wildlife Management Area came to being in the 1970s. Along about that time, something very interesting happened. And this was a function of a spectacular piece of congressional policy. At the congressional level, the Congress passed the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act in the late 60s. And it was an act that pulled money out of offshore oil and gas leasing on federally held properties and stuffed it into, diverted it into the conservation needs across the entire nation. In anticipation of being able to spend a bunch of that relatively new money, the federal agencies, which were lined up to get half of the annual allocations of this money, they all got busy and tried to scramble and come up with planning and programs that would enable them to get their fair share or then some for their particular agency purposes. In the case of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the service did not have any uniform means of classifying areas, describing habitats, or so on that was uniform nationally or even regionally, and certainly we didn't at the state level. So the service's response to this was, well, gee, we got to have a system of some sort. So they shotgunned letters out to the Audubon chapters, to the Wildlife Federation, to the Nature Conservancy, to all the other land managing agencies and said, hey, what do you people think of as the most unique wildlife ecosystems we have in our territory here? Highest on that list in Montana came up this Pine Butte swamp area along the Rocky Mountain front. it was nominated by any number of organizations. And why was that? Well, this area is fairly remote. It hasn't been extensively roaded. At the time it wasn't, and still isn't. It was regarded as very inhospitable, and particularly from a weather standpoint. We always used to joke when we were working along the front that it's one of those areas where within a 5-minute period, you could fall on the ice, slip on the ice, fall in the mud, get up and dust yourself off. That's how rapidly things change up there. Well, those weather and remoteness attributes contributed to making this a spectacular area for wildlife. And so it came up #1 on the Fish and Wildlife Service list. At that point, the Nature Conservancy, which was by then familiar with acting in response to agency requests to pre-acquire things before the federal government agencies could get their acquisition targets under congressional noses funding, the Conservancy would often step in and pre-acquire these places. So at that time, we, the Nature Conservancy, set about acquiring the Pine Butte Swamp Preserve. You see here in this photo a Landsat 5 image. This is dated in the mid-1980s, I think. My eyes are getting bad. I can't quite read the date on it, but this was an example of a technological advance that was being made in this time period. In this case, the use of satellite imagery became a tool for researching conservation and habitat needs. The craigheads from the Wildlands Institute out of Missoula, out of the University of Montana, began using satellite imaging. In this case, it was infrared imaging. And here you see our target area, the Rocky Mountain front, with the plains to the east and the mountains in the center of this photo. By using this, they could identify vegetation cover types and thereby understand where, say, grizzly bears in particular began, where we're using the habitats of the region on a seasonal basis. Here you see a researcher out there using radio telemetry along the front to help in bear tracking. And here they're putting a radio collar on a trapped grizzly. It was the result of these ground truthing efforts that led to the creation of these maps that showed where the seasonal habitats were. Here you can see spring range and summer range and denning habitats for the grizzlies. Well, the Pine Butte Swamp Preserve is right smack in the center right of this photo. And it has a high concentration of grizzly bear use there because of the wetlands and the spring foods and the winter kills. They come down after getting out of hibernation and can use those food sources. And so we had a high concentration of animals there. The grizzlies became the keystone species for conservation. They were the raison d'etre for working first along the front. Here you see, this didn't come out so well, but this is a Rocky Mountain front publication that was done. If you look in the lower part of this graphic, you see a date of September 1987. Management Guidelines for Selected Species, Rocky Mountain Front Studies. What's happening here is that in the late 70s, there began an oil boom along the Rocky Mountain front. We had a lot of roughnecks coming up from Oklahoma and Texas and oil familiar states and running roughshod over the landscape up there, doing exploration in preparation for developing what they were sure were going to be huge fields of oil and gas. It was out of consternation for this onslaught of oil and gas development that the land managing agencies started collaborating. This I found to be highly unusual because most of the time the federal agencies don't cooperate that well amongst each other, nor with the state in particular. Each agency has its mission, and they go about their mission without tying all their separate strings together to make a fabric of understanding. In this case, what they realized is that, holy moly, we got to get ahead of the curve here. We don't know how to respond to all of these leasing requests that are coming in, but we know we've got a wildlife rich area along the Rocky Mountain front. We better do something proactive so that we're ready to respond when these applications for leases come in, and we've got some idea where to deflect exploration and development, what rules and management guidelines to set up based on seasonal wildlife use of the area, and so on and so on. Thus, this report came into being, and it became a guide. It became a guide for lots of studies. Another interesting feature here is that, as I said, these agencies all figured out that instead of each of them, the BLM, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, State Fish, Wildlife and Parks, instead of each of them squandering their measly little budgets for wildlife research, they could pool those budgets and turn over lead responsibility to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks for studying the wildlife resources along the front. And those studies would then become the fruits of management guidelines for the respective agencies. So it was that we mapped the entirety of the front there. We mapped the stream importance of all the tributaries flowing to the east along the Continental Divide. Interestingly, elk have always been a driver species in terms of people's appetites for wildlife conservation. Where you get elk, you get a lot of interest from the public. So a major effort was put into studying the elk. And by the way, this was a multi-year wildlife study. So in the beginning, grizzlies became the first species to be studied. And then as budgets allowed, more and more of these species were identified, ground truthed, and put into maps. This one was a mule deer study along the front. Yes, thank you, Madison. Next. At the end of it all, we were then able to take all of this data and smush it into a useful graphic that enabled us to identify vulnerable habitats. You can't see it because of the scale here, but understandably enough, a lot of the vulnerable habitats became situated or to be found along roads, east-west running roads that penetrated the front. And that's where the highest at risk for rural subdivision. Those studies, by the way, that flowed from this 1987 research enabled us to develop management guidelines that were very useful. For example, in the case of the Pine Butte Preserve, we were able to say when oil and gas companies came and wanted to run roughshod over the preserve, we would say, well, you shouldn't be running your exploration and shot lines here at this time of the year. We recognize you have a dominant right to do so, but please do it in the fall after the ground is frozen and the grizzlies are done using that area. And by that means, we were able to get cooperation from the oil and gas industry and work things out relatively amicably. Interestingly, the Montana Oil and Gas Association and the Nature Conservancy also contributed to this multi-agency effort to study those wildlife resources. Anyway, you can see from that mapping technology that things were still kind of crude in the 1970s and 80s. By the time the 1990s rolled around, we had morphed into the use of geographic information systems. High advances in computer technology led to the use of GIS mapping, and those technological changes, along with the satellite imagery and so on, became new tools. So we had technology and study methods that morphed from 1970 to 2020. The threats of rural subdivision, roads, utility corridors, sod busting for a while was also one, believe it or not, and oil and gas, increased and decreased over that 1970 to 2020 timeline that we're talking about. Over that same time period, so too did statutes, policies, regulations, and planning change. I would just highlight three policy or statutory changes and policy changes that were really, really germane to the success of conservation along the front. The first was that in 2005, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service established the Rocky Mountain Front Conservation Area. This is an astonishing bit of federal land managing agency policy. Never before in the history of the country had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service identified 500,000 acres as a boundary area within which they could pursue conservation because of the high qualities of range, wetlands, and so on. First of its kind. Then in 2013, a lot of citizen work over the decade of the 90s and the early 2000s eventually culminated in the passage of the Rocky Mountain Front Heritage Act, 2013. This is an act in which Congress addressed the whole issue of the protection and conservation of federal lands within the Rocky Mountain Front area. So that act, while it addressed mostly federal lands, Forest Service, BLM lands in the front area, fact of the matter is that public attention and approval, and then indeed enthusiasm for protecting this remarkable area of Montana crescendoed. And then those of you who have followed the news this year know that just this summer, Congress passed on a permanent basis the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So going forward now, there will be a pot of federal money that continues to flow into these agencies and subsequent use by nonprofits and others who are engaged in conservation. Here we see a very telling graphic. This is dated 1996. You can see how little total private land conservation there was at that date. These tiny little red dots up there, and in the middle you can see the Nature Conservancy's Pine Butte Preserve. Now look, fast forward to 2020. Backwards.
Oops.
Backwards to 96. Back to 2020. It's a remarkable, remarkable story of conservation success. Here in this graphic, you can also see some considerable private lands conservation lying within the Blackfoot Indian Reservation. And so at the end of our story, what we're looking at is by 2020 here, we are looking at a long range story of successful conservation that is now involved in expansion and periodic restoration of key habitats along the front with the help of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and now the engagement of these many, many, many citizens, NGOs, and agencies. It's a success story running into the future. So this is what it looks like today. 295,000 acres under conservation easement protection. 185,000 of those acres have been done by nonprofits. 110,000 acres done by government agencies. That's the summation of what we regard as one of our successful subregions for conservation success. Thanks, and on to you, Bruce.
No, back to Jack.
Jack.
Okay, Madison. It's an amazing story of how strategy evolves with the times. And the Blackfoot is an example more of how a culture changes. Montana in general went from an extractive economy, a resource colony, to a place where now we think of stewardship and conservation. And the Blackfoot Valley is a place where I started first doing ecological baseline studies and designing conservation easements. And it began opportunistically with the Nature Conservancy and the Land Reliance. I was working with Bruce and Bob both. And this is a place where the human part of the story in this atlas, it begins to emerge. And that's Lam Lindbergh on the left and Hank Getz on the right. And Hank ran the Lubrecht Experimental Forest for years. And Lam Lindbergh had the Lindbergh Cattle Company ranch that's now paws up. And many of us are kind of bemoaning that, to be honest. But this valley shows you the importance of neighbor-to-neighbor communication, how an idea evolved from let's stop some rural subdivisions along the river. We don't like zoning. We don't like wild and scenic river status. Let's start doing some conservation easements. And Len Lindbergh and Hank were both very influential in bringing people together long-term to think about the whole valley. Because look at the linkage here between the lowland ranches and the scapegoat country. But the people that did these projects initially, this is a different time. This was Marguerite Heller, a retired school teacher, who Bob's written up something wonderful about her particular story. She had a modest pension and Social Security, and yet she donated an easement on a beautiful piece of land and had no tax benefits at all accruing to her. She did it because of the simple love of the place. On the right is Bill Potter, and then on the left, Mary, his partner, and they ran the EBARL. And when these easements started, Bill Potter said, well, I'm not sure I trust this. This sounds weird to me. But he said, all right, I'll do it when all the rest of you do it. And many years later, more than 20 years later, he finally put a conservation easement on the EBARL with river frontage all the way to the highlands. And now his granddaughter, Juanita Vero, who is the county commissioner in Missoula County, has the property. It's conserved, and she's running it as a dude ranch operation. So this particular river has been talked about almost to excess, where the river runs through it and so forth. But to me, what's so powerful, what emerged at first from the threat of subdivision and the fisheries focus, going out and be able to catch a beautiful fish, through time what began to happen is other threats emerged. And this map looks like a dog's breakfast, I guarantee you. It's not much help to you. It's kind of confusing. But the thing that created, in many ways, the Blackfoot Challenge and all the different stakeholders, ranchers, anglers, hunters, timber people, right, outfitters, communities, the sawmill in Seeley Lake and so forth, was a sense of the whole watershed. And the 7-Up Peak joint venture gold mining proposal kind of galvanized the watershed to think about it as a whole. Well, speaking back to what we began today, 40% of the private land in this watershed is not currently under conservation easement, much more being looked for. But this map, the upper watershed, shows you that every color other than the white areas shown in white is either under conservation easement, Montana Land Reliance in blue, Fish and Wildlife Service, Fish, Wildlife and Parks in kind of that purple, is either managed for conservation or under easement. You see a tremendous watershed-wide pattern. We want to do better with the atlas to really get the GIS, but also the human stories, because that's what makes this tale worth telling. And that same idea of the Blackfoot Challenge is now in the hands of, is becoming political. And the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act that John Tester is reintroducing, once again, is that partnership, set of partnerships and transactions, all the different interests pulling together to try to save place. That's a very human tale worth telling. Now I'll pass the ball on to Bruce.
Thank you. My focus is on the rattlesnake area just adjacent to Missoula. The question came up early on in the three of our association. Where do these conservation areas come from? You know, the transition of population in Montana. You come in and here it is, all good, go out and enjoy. And so how does that evolve? The watershed, many of you are probably familiar with it. The stream enters into the Clark Fork of the Columbia right at the University of Montana across the river. It extends, it's one of the Missoula Five Valleys. It extends 26 miles northward. It's about 69 square miles. And the upper watershed is mountainous, and there's some 45 lakes up there, elevations ranging up to 8,000 feet, and where Missoula is just over 3,200. All of that produces clear, cold water, a resource recognized for early on in the settlement of Missoula, but before that recognized as the whole Missoula area by the native people as a place of the little bull trout. So that resource became the water supply for Missoula, and that comes into the enjoyment of the place by, as we see it now. Here's the trailhead about 4.5 miles north of downtown, family enjoying it. If you go up there to make use of the area, it's not unusual to drive by vehicles parked for about a half mile on both sides of the street of the entryway. But this is what it looked like back before 1980. And here the detail is not quite so important as just to give you a sense of the pattern of ownership, particularly the orange color. It's Montana Power Company. Montana Power Company had evolved into, one of their assets was the Missoula Water Company. They ran that for many years. They dammed up the creek over 100 years ago, and they took over ownership of a variety of what were originally railroad land grant sections in alternate sections. Their 21,000 plus acres covered about half of the whole watershed. Checkerboarded with the Forest Service, made up the northern 2/3 of the watershed. So the start of this conservation story, the context is for the total area, half of which Montana Power. The Rattlesnake Recreation Area and Wilderness Act was passed in 1980. That came out of a fairly strong community effort to get that designation. In that legislation, there was a direction to the Forest Service to make Montana Power Company whole. And so in the end, what we wound up with was something that looks like this. The crosshatch area is the recreation area and wilderness as it now exists. But the transaction that put it in place was a land exchange for Montana Power Company for something called coal bidding credits. And at that time, the Montana Power Company had a subsidiary mining coal on federal land in southeastern Montana. What they did was this trade enabled them to pay off some of their lease payments until they were credited with the full value of their lands in the Rattlesnake. Lands that otherwise, with 10 miles of stream frontage and another 10 lakes in the uplands, were prime subdivision development and could have gone a very different way. Since that time, since 1983, when the exchange was done, to present, there has been some 18 additional transactions that have added almost 5,000 acres to the lower Rattlesnake, particularly on the upper hillsides, for further conservation efforts. Each one kind of supporting the next over time, and a wide variety of techniques were employed. Donations, municipal bond-based purchases, multi-party land trades, bargain sales, and within that resource, miles and miles of public trails, elk and deer winter range protection, habitat for grizzly, wolf, cutthroat trout, and of course the bull trout fishery, and the ever-present and desired four-season recreation. The context for that is particularly interesting as we look back at where did all this come from. What we're looking at here is a bigger picture that extends from the Rattlesnake area, and which is, I don't know if my pointer shows that up there, and Missoula. It now incorporates the Mission Mountains, tribal wilderness, Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe, recent transactions by the Nature Conservancy acquiring Plum Creek timberland, and of course the Rocky Mountain front that Bob talked about, and the Blackfoot drainage next door presents an enormous regional success in conservation. And just a little bit of irony, initially in the efforts to designate the recreation and wilderness area, the Forest Service was concerned that the Rattlesnake Wilderness was too small and isolated. Well, we've evolved from there. And going back, here's the dam that was built over 100 years ago. And I'm quite happy to report that the dam is just removed in the last 30 days, and the riparian area is being restored, and the bull trout now are free to run up their historical and prehistorical range along with cutthroat trout. It's a different day in the Rattlesnake. Jack?
Okay, so that's basically the big conservation idea that we want to talk about and stretch our legs into these human stories, GIS, the cartography, the landscape ecology, the linkages that remain exposed and might be best conserved as soon as we could. This will have maps, photos, evocative text. There'll be a website that can be updatable. And what a great source of research opportunities for ecologists and people of all backgrounds to say, all right, how can I take what I know or what I want to learn and be part of a larger picture of conservation? And I think the opportunities are immense here. And so we feel inspired, but we also want the reader to feel, how can I aspire to help? What could I do? This is a book, when we imagined it, for a person that loves the land that may or may not be a scientist, that a landowner, a neighbor, somebody who simply cares, because data do not make decisions. Well, no. Idiosyncratic, culturally based human beings do, and we all need hope, now more than ever, perhaps. We think that this example in Montana shines a bright light on the place, the successes that will emerge by linking landscape ecology, economics, and the transactional conservation that we've hinted at today. And we feel quite happy that Ed Wilson, we've communicated with him and his Half-Earth concept, his Half-Earth Institute. He feels that this project might be part of a global story of how do you get here, because the very same ethics and methods that we're speaking of here, adapted for other places, we see working in Botswana and Sri Lanka and around the world. So that's what we had in mind today, and we really appreciate you all being here. We'd love to hear your take, get your counsel, any and all ideas how to make this better? Any questions you had? So thank you for listening. And Madison, we're open for questions.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Yes, so for those attending, I haven't seen any questions coming through the chat, but please feel free at this moment to either put those into the chat function, or you can unmute yourself, turn your video on if you do have a question, and yeah, ask directly.
So I have a question. This is Bruce. What do you see as, and any one of you can answer this, I think, are the primary impediments now, given that it's 2020, to increasing the effort towards developing conservation easements and this approach to conservation? And then again, on the other side of that fence is what are the things that now make it easier to do those things?
Guys, who would like to take this?
I can begin the response. The answer has many parts. The fascinating thing about this is the way in which conservation, which motivates us all in different ways, is acted upon here, and acted upon in a transactional way. And what we've discovered, and what we've found that the United States is leading in worldwide, is the technology of transactions and the creativity in which the various resources can be brought to bear to apply towards decisions that are made in a permanent way for land conservation. So what we find is a variety of new techniques for funding, new techniques for strategy, the ecological strategy, conservation strategies, very important, and the GIS technology to support that technology is evolving quite rapidly. So I think that's part of the direction that is in front of us.
I would add to that, Bruce, you asked about what, among other things, would the impediments to ongoing success using these conservation techniques be? And I would cite rural subdivision as one of the major problems. What you see, and what we know over time, is that real estate markets rise and fall in kind of sine waves. Well, right now, Montana, in the 60s and 70s, Montana experienced an incredible land rush. People were carving up landscapes, especially in western Montana, into 5-acre parcels. Subdivision laws got changed. We're now up to requiring more local governing body review of subdivisions. But the division, the fragmentation of land remains, in my mind, a major impediment getting in the way of this kind of conservation. We're trying to stay ahead of the curve with these kinds of initiatives, but always breathing on our tail are developers and subdividers who want what's out there on these beautiful Montana landscapes. And so we just have to make sure that this conservation work proceeds at a pace faster than the developers can get their hands on it.
And if I may add, I think one of the drivers that's allowed this success, ironically, has been the appreciation of land value. And therefore, when somebody donates a conservation easement, what they're giving up can be appraised much higher. And one of the opportunities that thus far has maintained is the tremendous support in Congress for these tax deductions. On the conservative side, both agriculture and it's a tax break. On the Democrat or progressive side this is good conservation. And these available tax benefits are now, there's no sunset date. They're enacted within the IRS codes as long as we hope that they will. So next question, Madison, anybody?
James Pritchard here.
Oh,
I have a question. I was trying to think, and I can't remember just offhand, but University of Wyoming recently put out a kind of an atlas of Wyoming and the wildlife migrations, I think.
Yes.
That was
Yes.
a really neat project, and it kind of makes me think of your project. Can you think of any other books similar to what you're thinking of? And I want to go ahead.
Well, it's a very good question, man. We really did scour around to see, has anybody done an atlas like this or an interpretation like this? And we see individual land trusts or groups, they'll have their own record, but they won't integrate it with what other people are doing. It seems to be disconnected. We've seen there's a group called the Malpai Borderlands Group in Southwest New Mexico that has done Working Wilderness, is a book by Nathan Sayer, who teaches at Berkeley. And that talks about the culture and the issues and the threats and the opportunities. And they were able to get so far ahead of the curve, they were buying conservation easements for $100 an acre. There was so little land development, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Foundation and Turner and everybody else was funding that. So, but that doesn't exactly do what we're talking about. And also, it's fair to say, you know, Montana has the most acres under conservation easement of any state in the union. Rather remarkable story. So why not start here?
If I could add to that, Jack, there are a variety of studies that you all are probably quite familiar with in the greater Yellowstone area. One fairly recent one that I saw, specifically speaking towards the migration, is the elk movement in the Paradise Valley, and how that is affecting ranching use there and subdivision development, and the threat of brucellosis transmission to cattle. But the connectivity idea, whether it's I think elk again have been a driver. You know, where do all the elk in the park go the rest of the year? And then where do the predators follow? That has moved the needle on conservation extensively in the Madison and Paradise Valley and around into Idaho and Wyoming. It's quite a story all by itself, and is another focus area deserving of the same kind of presentation we've talked about. There have been regional conservation strategies done for Montana with particular focus. One was on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and looking at the whole route to see if there were particular opportunities for conservation. Acquisitions came out of that. There are conservation strategies for Lewis and Clark County done several years ago. Missoula County did one. Mineral County did one on river-based strategies. So there are bits and pieces, and but the technology now with GIS, you know, those studies took months and months and months and a lot of work hours. And with GIS technology, that possibility of going on a much broader and more accurate scale is there.
Awesome. So let's one more question. Marie, I saw.
Yeah, thanks. This is Marie, and I'm actually curious, kind of looking ahead, with subdivisions probably being inevitable, what kind of tools or opportunities are there to create conservation, whether they're easements or something else, you know, on those smaller pieces of property that you're aware of, or that you could imagine, I guess?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
My rule of thumb is that for these techniques to be most effective, you need to be about 10 years ahead of the active subdivision development. The effort that it takes to pick up the pieces, you know, a few acres at a time or half acre at a time is really a challenge. And what we've seen in the areas that have had that kind of subdivision activity, you look for opportunities over time, you pick them up as you can, consolidate, and make sure you have the support you need to bring the resources to bear to complete those acquisitions. Because you're looking at a multiple of value for this individual acreages of, anywhere from 5 to 10, 15 times what the per acre value is in ranch land.
So we're a little bit after 1 p.m. and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know there might be more questions and everything, but James, if you want to ask the final question and then we can sign off at that point.
Do you think the bison, free-ranging bison idea is going to go anywhere?
Bruce?
Another of our project area focus is the American Prairie Reserve. And so that's been, Bob and I were involved early on with the strategy of identifying that region to focus for their acquisition. We've stayed involved as their representatives in acquisitions. It's a controversial one, and we keep looking for ideas that make a broader support possible for bison on a voluntary basis. And, maybe over time we'll get there. There are some really promising efforts on the Rocky Mountain front. The Blackfeet tribe is doing some great things. The Salish and Kootenai. All of the reservations are participating in the bison that have been taken out of the park that have overpopulated there. So lots of good possibilities.
Cultural change will catch up, I believe, personally, because you look at the newspaper editorials when Glacier Park was proposed, they hated the idea. There wasn't a paper in this state that supported it because it was the Anaconda Company kind of running the narrative. So cultures change.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much again for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
This was recorded. I posted the link in the chat, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.